The morning they told me I could go home, I sent a message to the family group chat. 3 words, "Can someone come?" My daughter read it. I could see the little checkmark turn. She didn't reply for 11 minutes. Then, "Dad, we're kind of in the middle of something. Can you get a ride?" I sat on the edge of the hospital bed in my paper gown and my socks with the little rubber grips on the bottom, and I read that message 4 times. My son-in-law replied 30 seconds later. "Uber is like $12 from there, lol lol." I'm 63 years old. I had just had a mitral valve repair. I had a 6-inch incision down the center of my chest held together with surgical wire, and my daughter's husband was sending me a laughing emoji about a $12 Uber. The nurse, a young woman named Patricia, wait, I can't use that name, let me think. A young woman named Donna, she saw my face. She didn't say anything, she just handed me a warm blanket from the cart and quietly left the room. I appreciated that more than she knew. I called a car service. The driver who showed up was a man in his 60s, maybe older, with a green pine tree air freshener hanging from the mirror and a radio station playing old soul music low. He looked at me when I got in, slow and careful, and he said, "You just get out of the hospital, sir." I said I did. He said, "Family meeting you at home?" I didn't answer right away. He nodded, like he understood, and didn't ask again. His name was Oscar. I know because it was printed on the little card on the back of the headrest. Oscar M. He drove me the whole 22 minutes without talking. And when we pulled up to the house, he got out and opened my door and waited while I stood up straight and caught my breath. Then he handed me a card from his shirt pocket. "My personal number," he said. "You ever need a ride and don't want to mess with the app?" I thanked him. I meant it. The house was quiet when I walked in. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is, whatever else she is, she and her husband had been living with me for 2 years. That was my idea. After her mother passed, the house felt like a museum. Too many rooms, too much silence. I told them they could stay while they saved money. My son-in-law had between jobs and my daughter was picking up freelance work, and I thought, this is what family does. Her name is Nadine. I'm not going to dance around it or call her something else. Nadine Lynn Hargrove, née Calder, 34 years old, my only child. Her husband is Fletcher. Fletcher Hargrove. He sells, or sold depending on when you're reading this, solar panels. Not the installing kind, the talking people in the buying kind. He's good at it. He's good at a lot of things that involve convincing people of things. When I came through the front door with my hospital bag and my discharge papers in a manila envelope, neither of them came to meet me. Nadine called from the kitchen. "Dad, you eat yet?" "No," I said. "There's leftover pasta in the fridge." I stood in the hallway and looked at the framed photo on the wall. Me and Nadine when she was maybe 9, fishing off the dock at my brother's place in Michigan. She's holding up a little bluegill like it's a marlin, grinning so wide you can see she's missing her 2 front teeth. I went and heated up the pasta myself. That night I could hear them talking in low voices behind their bedroom door. The walls in that house are not thick. I've lived there for 27 years, and I know exactly what you can hear from where. Standing in the hallway outside their door, I could catch words. Retirement account. Property value. What did the doctor actually say? I went to bed. Now, here's something I have to explain because it matters. 3 weeks before my surgery, before I even knew I was going to need surgery, when it was still just, "We'd like to run some more tests," I got a letter from an attorney in Columbus. His name was Howard Pruitt, and he was the estate attorney for my Uncle Clarence who had passed in February. I hadn't seen Clarence in probably 15 years. He was my father's younger brother, never married, no children, lived alone in a house outside Columbus on a piece of land that had been in our family since the 1940s. The letter said I was the sole beneficiary of his estate. I want to be careful here, because I'm not trying to make this sound like more than it was. Clarence was not a rich man by any conventional definition, but he had lived simply for 50 years on land that had appreciated considerably. The estate, after taxes and attorney fees, came to just under $420,000. And the land itself, 11 acres in a county that had been quietly absorbing Columbus sprawl for the past decade, was being evaluated separately. I hadn't told Nadine. I hadn't told anyone. Not out of secrecy, exactly. More because I'd barely processed it myself. And then the cardiology appointment started happening fast. And then there was the surgery date, and there just wasn't a moment that felt right. Or maybe I was waiting to see something. I'm still not sure which it was. After I came home from the hospital, things changed in that house. Slowly at first, then fast. It started with small things. Fletcher offered to carry my laundry upstairs. Nadine made soup, real soup, from scratch, with the bay leaves and everything. One evening, I came downstairs and she was on the couch with a notepad, asking me if I had everything I needed from the pharmacy. Did I need her to pick anything up? She sat close to me and her voice was soft. I thought, maybe I'd been unfair. Maybe coming home from heart surgery put things in perspective for all of us. Then, about 4 days after I got home, Fletcher sat down across from me at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee. He did this slowly, like a man who had rehearsed it. He asked me how I was feeling. I said I was feeling all right. He said he and Nadine had been thinking. They'd been talking about the future, about stability, about, making sure everyone was taken care of. He used the phrase legacy planning like he'd looked it up the night before, which I suspect he had. He said he'd been in touch with a financial advisor. He said it might be a good time to think about consolidating assets, simplifying things. He mentioned, casually, like it had just occurred to him, that the house was a significant asset and that property values in this area had gone up considerably, and that if I was open to it, there were some structures that could protect everything and make sure it transferred smoothly. Structures, I said. Trusts. That kind of thing. He wrapped both hands around his mug. We just want to make sure you're protected, Harold. My name is not Harold. My name is Clem. Clement Ray Dobbins. But the way he said it, that gentle, careful voice, it was the same voice he used when he was selling solar panels. I had heard it 100 times through the walls. I said, "That's thoughtful, Fletcher. Let me think about it." He nodded and smiled and refilled my coffee. I looked at him across that table and I thought, you read that letter. I didn't have proof. I still don't, technically. But the letter from Howard Pruitt had been in my desk drawer. And sometime in the last 2 weeks, my desk drawer had been opened and not quite closed all the way. And the envelope had been moved. I noticed things like that. 40 years in construction management will do that to you. You learn to see when something isn't where it was. That night, I called Oscar. He picked up on the second ring. I asked him if he had time the next morning to take me somewhere. He said yes. I asked him to come at 7 before Nadine and Fletcher were up. He said he'd be there. The next morning, I got up at 6, dressed slowly, and wrote a note that said I had an early doctor's appointment. I took the manila envelope from the hospital and my own file folder from the bottom of the closet, the one with the Pruitt correspondence and my existing will and the deed to the house, and I put them in a canvas grocery bag and walked out to the driveway. Oscar was already there. Green pine tree. Soul music low. Howard Pruitt's office was in a building downtown with a parking garage and a lobby with fake plants. He met me himself at the elevator, which I hadn't expected. He was younger than he'd sounded on the phone. Maybe 50, trim gray at the temples. He shook my hand carefully, like he knew about the surgery. We sat in his office for almost 2 hours. When I walked back out to Oscar's car, I had signed several documents. I had updated my will. I had placed the house in a revocable living trust with terms that were very specific about who could and could not benefit from it and under what conditions. I had also, on Howard Pruitt's advice, drafted a separate letter to be held in his office. A letter that would explain everything, in my own words, to be delivered at a time of my choosing or in the event of my death. Howard had said gently, "You understand this can be changed. It's revocable. You can revisit any of this." I said I understood. He said, "Is there anything you'd like me to know about the circumstances?" I told him about the family group chat, about the $12 Uber, about the phrase legacy planning delivered over coffee by a man who 4 days earlier couldn't be bothered to drive 20 minutes. Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I see." 2 words, but I felt seen. Back at the house, Nadine had made breakfast. Eggs, toast, orange juice. She'd set the table with the good placemats. She asked about my appointment, and I said it went fine, just a routine follow-up. Over the next 2 weeks, the campaign, I'll call it that, continued. Fletcher mowed the lawn without being asked. Nadine took over the grocery shopping and started making meals I hadn't eaten since her mother was alive. Pot roast, lemon chicken, the soup with the bay leaves. They watched TV with me in the evenings. They laughed at my jokes. I let them. I want to be honest about something. Part of me wanted it to be real. Part of me sat at that dinner table and watched my daughter pass me the bread, and thought maybe this is what it takes. Maybe it took something almost happening to me for all of us to slow down. I'm 63, not dead. I know what hope feels like, and I know how it can make you see things that aren't there. But then Fletcher started asking about the Columbus property. I didn't know Uncle Clarence had land out there, Nadine said one evening. We were watching the news. She said it without looking at me. He did, I said. Is it a lot? The land? I don't know exactly yet, I said. The estate is still being settled. But you're the beneficiary, so the letter says. Fletcher was quiet through all of this, which was more telling than anything he could have said. The next morning, I woke up to find them both in the kitchen at 7 a.m. with the laptop open and a county property records website on the screen. They closed it when I came in, but not quickly enough. 11 acres. Whatever they'd found it. Nadine made me coffee. She smiled. She asked how I'd slept. I slept fine, I said. That afternoon, while they were both out, Fletcher at what he called a client lunch, and Nadine at a yoga class that had suddenly reappeared in her schedule after months of absence, I called Oscar again. I asked him to take me to the bank. I did what I needed to do. I also stopped by a locksmith, not for the front door, for my desk. About a week after that, a Tuesday, Fletcher sat me down again. This time there was no coffee, no preamble. He had a folder. Inside the folder were printed pages, estate documents, trust structures, something that appeared to be a draft of a quitclaim deed. We wanted to talk to you about some options, he said. Nadine was beside him. She was looking at the table. I looked at the papers for a long moment. Then I looked up at Fletcher. I said, "Where did you get these?" He said they'd consulted a financial advisor independently just to understand the options. I said, "A quitclaim deed removes me from the title of my own home, Fletcher." He said, "Not permanently, it's just a structure." "A structure," I said. He stopped. I picked up the folder and held it and didn't say anything for a moment. Then I set it back down on the table. "I'd like you both to move out," I said. "I'll give you 60 days. That's more than the law requires and more than what the situation warrants, but I'm saying 60 days. Nadine looked up. "Dad." "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me. "I'm just done." Fletcher started to say something about how I was misunderstanding, how they were trying to help, how a man in my position after a surgery like mine needed people around him who— "Fletcher," I said, "I need you to stop talking." He stopped. I stood up from the table, which took me a second because my chest still pulled when I moved fast, and I walked to the kitchen and I called Oscar. "You feel like a drive?" I said. He said, "Be there in 20. I want to tell you what the next few weeks looked like, because it wasn't dramatic." Nadine tried to talk to me twice. Once she cried, real tears, and I sat with her and held her hand and said I loved her, because I do. I always will. But love doesn't mean I have to hand over my house and my land and the last thing my Uncle Clarence left behind. Love isn't a signature on a document. Fletcher tried once through a text message to explain that he'd been misled by bad advice and that the quitclaim thing wasn't his idea. I didn't respond to that one. They were out in 53 days. The week after they left, I had a long call with Howard Pruitt. The Columbus land had been fully appraised, 11 acres, and because of the way the county lines had shifted in a commercial development 3 miles east, it was valued at significantly more than either of us had initially expected. Howard used the word considerable twice in the same sentence, which for an estate attorney is practically a shout. I also had a call with a woman from a nonprofit in Columbus that builds affordable housing. My Uncle Clarence had volunteered with them for years, which I hadn't known. She called to express condolences and mentioned gently that Clarence had hoped someone in the family might consider continuing his involvement. I flew to Columbus the following month. Oscar drove me to the airport. He refused to let me pay him. I said, "Oscar, I'm calling you a ride. You can't drive me to the airport for free." He said, "Consider it a favor between old men." I laughed. First real laugh in a long time. The Columbus trip was 3 days. I walked the land with a woman from the nonprofit and a local developer who had been working with them on a mixed-income housing project that had stalled for lack of a key parcel. I stood in a field in November with mud on my boots and dead grass as far as I could see. And I thought about Clarence, who I barely knew, who had lived quietly on this land for 50 years and left it to me without conditions or instructions, except through the people who knew him. I made some decisions on that trip that I'm not ready to write about in full, but when I got home, the house felt different, cleaner, like something had been let out. Nadine called me on a Thursday about 6 weeks after the Columbus trip. Not a text, a phone call. She asked if she could come over. I said yes. She sat in the living room in the chair her mother used to sit in, and she looked at me for a long time before she spoke. She said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I waited. "I let him convince me," she said. "Fletcher. He found that letter and he started talking about. He made it sound like we were helping you. And I knew. I knew it wasn't right, but I went along with it." I said, "I know. Are you ever going to forgive me?" I thought about that fishing photo in the hallway. The bluegill, the missing teeth. Eventually, I said, "Give it some time." She nodded. She didn't push. That was the first mature thing I'd seen from her in a long time, and I told her so. She smiled a little. "Mom always said I took forever to grow up. Your mother," I said, "was almost always right." We sat there for a while without talking, which is something we hadn't done since her mother died. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was honest. Sometimes that's the best you can do. Fletcher, from what I understand, is back to selling solar panels. He and Nadine separated about 2 months after they moved out. She's in an apartment on the west side, the kind of place that's fine for now. I've met her for lunch twice. We don't talk about the house or the land or the paperwork. We talk about small things. What she's been reading, whether I'm eating enough. I'm eating fine. Donna from the hospital sent a follow-up card, which I wasn't expecting. Oscar still drives me sometimes when I don't feel like dealing with the app, and he still refuses to charge me full price, and I've stopped arguing about it. I am 63 years old. My chest is healing. My house is quiet in the way I choose now, not in the way that was imposed on me. And somewhere in Columbus, on 11 acres of land that my Uncle Clarence tended for half a century, something new is being built. He never told me what to do with it. He just trusted me to figure it out. I'm working on it.